It's easy to call yourself a good person when kindness costs you nothing, but character is revealed the moment helping someone requires a sacrifice. When a poor stranger carrying a hungry baby asked for a little milk, the wealthiest merchant in town refused. Everyone watched. No one spoke, except one widow, whose next decision wouldn't just feed a child. It would expose the true value of every person standing in that store. Before we continue, if stories about compassion, redemption, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things inspire you, take a moment to subscribe. There are many more unforgettable journeys ahead, and we'd love to have you with us. Now let's begin. The autumn wind swept through the empty streets of Ash Creek, carrying dust, fallen leaves, and the smell of fresh bread from the town bakery. People hurried from one shop to another. Mothers held their children's hands. Merchants proudly displayed vegetables outside their stores. Horse-drawn wagons rolled slowly over the muddy roads. It looked like any other peaceful morning, but just beyond the busy marketplace, hidden behind abandoned buildings, where no respectable townsfolk ever looked, a man slowly opened his eyes. He had spent the night sleeping on cold wooden boards beneath an old loading dock. His coat was little more than patched pieces of worn fabric, stitched together countless times. The knees of his trousers had almost disappeared beneath years of repairs. His boots no longer kept the cold out. Every movement reminded him how exhausted his body had become. Yet the first thing he did wasn't stretch. It wasn't stand. It wasn't even check whether his own stomach could survive another hungry day. Instead, he turned toward the tiny bundle sleeping beside him. For several long seconds, he simply watched, making sure the little chest still rose and fell, rose and fell. Only then did he finally breathe again. Wrapped inside an old wool blanket was a baby no older than 6 months. The blanket wasn't clean. It wasn't soft, but every corner had been carefully folded to keep the morning wind away from the child's tiny face. The baby slept peacefully, completely unaware that the man watching over him hadn't eaten a proper meal in nearly 3 days. The man's name was Elias Reed. To everyone in Ash Creek, he was nothing more than another homeless drifter. But to the little child sleeping beside him, he was the entire world. Elias gently brushed a loose strand of hair away from the baby's forehead. A small smile appeared across his tired face. "Morning, little one." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I guess it's another adventure today." The baby slowly opened sleepy blue eyes. For a brief second, he stared at Elias. Then, a tiny smile appeared. It wasn't much, just enough to melt away an entire night's worth of pain. Elias laughed softly. "That's better. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten how." A faint rumble escaped Elias' stomach. He ignored it. Instead, he reached inside an old canvas bag resting beside him. He searched every pocket, every corner. Nothing, not a single crumb remained. He had given the last piece of bread to the baby the previous evening after soaking it in warm water until it became soft enough to swallow. He had told himself he wasn't hungry, even though he hadn't stopped thinking about food all night. The baby's smile slowly disappeared. His tiny hands reached toward Ilya's. Then came the familiar sound. A weak cry. Not loud, not desperate, almost too tired to be called crying anymore. Ilyas immediately picked him up. "It's okay. I know. He gently rocked the baby against his shoulder. The child rested his tiny head beneath Ilyas' chin. Still crying, still hungry, Ilyas looked toward the busy town. The bakery had already opened. People carried warm loaves wrapped in brown paper. Children happily drank fresh milk outside a nearby cafe. The smell drifted through the air. The baby's tiny nose twitched. Even he could smell it. His cries became a little louder. Ilyas closed his eyes. "I'll find you some. I promise." 3 days earlier, everything had changed. Ilyas had wandered behind the old stone church, searching through discarded crates for leftover food. The alley was unusually quiet. Then he heard it, a cry, so faint, he almost mistook it for a kitten. He followed the sound. Behind a broken barrel, wrapped inside a dirty blanket, lay a tiny baby, completely alone. No bottle, no note, no family, nothing, just a frightened child crying into an empty alley, while people passed only a few yards away without ever looking down. Ilyas knelt beside the child. He looked around. "Hello?" His voice echoed between the buildings. "Is someone missing a baby?" No answer. He waited. 10 minutes, 20, nearly an hour. Still no one came. The baby's crying grew weaker. Ilyas looked into those tiny, frightened eyes. For reasons he couldn't explain, he saw himself, years ago, standing alone after losing the only place he had ever called home. Forgotten, rejected, left behind. He slowly picked up the baby. "I know," he whispered. "I know exactly how that feels." That night, instead of sleeping beneath the loading dock alone, there were 2 hearts trying to survive the cold. The next morning, Ilyas begged for work. No one hired him. He begged for food. Most ignored him. The few coins strangers tossed into his worn hat, he spent on milk. Not bread, not soup, milk. The shopkeeper asked once, "You buying that for yourself?" Ilyas smiled. "I wish." Since finding the baby, he had eaten only what restaurants threw into their garbage bins after closing. Half a potato, cold beans, pieces of stale bread. Whenever he found something edible, he ate only enough to stay standing. The rest, he somehow turned into food for the baby. More than once, he had quietly walked away from food because there wasn't enough money left to buy milk afterward. His stomach could wait. The baby's couldn't. Back beneath the loading dock, the little boy cried again. Ilyas looked at the nearly empty bottle beside him. One final drop slid onto the baby's tongue. Then, nothing. The bottle was empty. Ilyas turned it upside down. Not another drop came out. He sighed. "I was hoping it would somehow refill itself." The baby looked up at him with trusting eyes. Too young to understand hunger. Too young to understand fear. Too young to understand that the man holding him had absolutely nothing left. Elias carefully wrapped the blanket tighter around the child, then stood. His knees almost gave way from exhaustion. He steadied himself against the wooden post. "You deserve better than this." He looked toward the center of town, toward the largest building on the busiest street, Whitmore General Store. Everyone knew it. If there was milk anywhere in Ash Creek, it would be there. He took a deep breath. He hated begging. Every part of him hated it. But pride had no place beside a starving child. The walk through town felt longer than ever. People noticed him immediately. Some crossed the street to avoid him. Others covered their noses. Children pointed. A young boy asked his mother, "Was that man carrying a baby?" His mother quietly pulled him away. "Don't stare." No one asked whether the baby was all right. No one asked whether they needed help. They simply looked, then kept walking. Elias finally reached the large wooden doors of Whitmore General Store. Inside, shelves overflowed with flour, sugar, fresh bread, cheese, butter, barrels filled with grain. Glass bottles of fresh milk rested inside metal tubs packed with ice. The smell alone made his empty stomach ache. Customers chatted cheerfully while baskets overflowed with food. Behind the polished wooden counter stood Harold Whitmore, the richest merchant in Ash Creek. He looked up as Elias entered. His warm smile disappeared instantly. His eyes dropped to Elias' torn clothes, then to the baby, then back again. The entire store slowly fell silent. Every customer turned to watch. Elias swallowed what little pride he had left. He stepped toward the counter, holding the hungry baby a little closer. His voice was quiet, almost embarrassed. "Sir," he looked down at the child, then back at the merchant. "Can you spare some milk for my baby?" The store remained silent, not the peaceful kind of silence, the uncomfortable kind, the kind that spreads through a room when everyone knows someone is about to be humiliated. But nobody wants to stop it. Harold Whitmore looked Elias up and down. His wrinkled coat, his muddy boots, his unshaven face. Then his eyes settled on the baby, sleeping weakly against Elias' chest. Instead of sympathy, a smile slowly spread across Harold's face. Not a warm smile, a mocking one. "You've got some nerve." Several customers exchanged uneasy glances. Elias lowered his eyes. "I'm not asking for money." Harold folded his arms. "I noticed. I'm asking for milk. For the baby." Harold leaned against the counter. "And who's going to pay for it?" Elias reached into his coat pocket. He already knew what he would find. Nothing. Still, he searched anyway. Perhaps a forgotten coin, a button mistaken for copper. Anything. His fingers closed around empty cloth. He slowly pulled out his hand. Nothing rested inside it. His shoulders sank. His voice cracked. "I don't have anything today." Harold laughed, loud enough for the entire store to hear. "I figured as much." He pointed toward the rows of milk bottles behind him. "You see those? They're not free." The baby stirred. A soft cry escaped from beneath the blanket. Elias instinctively rocked him. "It's all right." His voice became almost a whisper. "We're trying." Harold rolled his eyes. "You know what amazes me?" He looked around the store. It's always the same. They come in wearing rags. They tell a sad story. And suddenly, everyone is supposed to feel guilty. Several customers forced small laughs, not because they found it funny, because laughing was easier than speaking. An elderly woman, standing near the flour sacks, quietly looked away. A young couple shopping for supplies lowered their heads. Even the blacksmith near the doorway shifted uncomfortably. No one agreed with Harold, but no one challenged him either. His store supplied half the town. Making an enemy of him came with consequences. Elias gently adjusted the blanket around the baby. "I'm not asking for charity." Harold raised an eyebrow. "No, I'll work." Harold laughed again. I'll sweep. I'll unload wagons. I'll clean the stable. I'll do anything. I only need enough milk for him." Harold slowly walked around the counter. He stopped only a few feet from Elias. "So, you expect me to believe that baby is yours?" Elias looked down at the little boy. "No." Harold blinked. No. A few customers looked up. That wasn't the answer they expected. Harold smirked. "So whose is it?" "I don't know." The merchant burst into laughter. "There it is." I knew something didn't add up. He turned toward the customers. "Did you hear that? He doesn't even know who the baby's parents are." More nervous laughter echoed through the store. Harold looked back at Elias. "So let me understand. You found somebody else's baby, and now you're walking around town, pretending to be some hero." Elias quietly shook his head. "I'm not pretending." "Then why are you carrying him?" Elias looked at the sleeping child. "Because no one else would." The words landed heavily inside the room. Even Harold hesitated, only for a moment. Then his smile returned. "Oh, please. You expect us to believe that?" He leaned closer. "I've seen men like you before. You use children to make people feel sorry for you." "I don't. You expect me to believe you've been buying milk instead of food." "Yes," Harold scoffed. "Why?" Elias answered without looking up. "Because he can't survive without it." "I can." The words struck several customers, harder than they expected. The elderly woman quietly wiped at the corner of her eye. The blacksmith clenched his jaw. The young couple looked at the baby again. For the first time, they weren't seeing a beggar. They were seeing a man who hadn't eaten so someone else could. Then, the baby began crying again. Not loudly. The cries were weak, broken, almost exhausted. Elias immediately started rocking him. "I'm sorry. I know you're hungry." His own stomach growled loudly. The sound echoed in the quiet store. Harold heard it. "So you're starving too?" Elias nodded once. "Yes." Harold crossed his arms. "You should have spent your money on yourself." Elias smiled sadly. "If I had, he would have gone hungry." At the very back of the store, a woman wearing a simple navy blue dress quietly watched everything. She hadn't spoken since Elias entered. She hadn't laughed. She hadn't looked away. Unlike everyone else, she wasn't watching Elias. She was watching the baby. Then she watched something else. Every single time the child whimpered, Elias instinctively adjusted the blanket, checked the baby's breathing, touched the tiny forehead, whispered softly until the crying eased. He did it without thinking, without trying to impress anyone. It wasn't performance. It was instinct. The woman quietly studied his face. There was no desperation in the way he cared for the child. Only love, the kind that asks for nothing in return. She glanced toward Harold, then back at Elias. Something inside her began to ache, because she knew grief. She knew loneliness. Years earlier, she had buried both her husband and the infant daughter they had prayed for. She remembered what it felt like to leave the cemetery carrying empty arms. Now, standing only a few yards away, she watched a homeless man holding a child, as though losing him would mean losing the last reason to keep breathing. Harold suddenly slapped the counter. Enough, he pointed toward the door. You've wasted enough of my customers' time. Elias didn't move. Please. Harold's voice hardened. I said leave. I only need one bottle. No, I'll repay you. With what? My labor. Harold laughed. Your promises don't pay my bills. The baby let out another tiny cry, this one barely louder than a whisper. His little movements had grown weaker. Elias looked down. His heart sank. He knew that cry. It wasn't getting louder anymore. It was disappearing. He swallowed hard, then quietly asked one last time, please? He hasn't had milk since yesterday. Harold's face remained cold. So, the single word echoed through the store. Several customers looked down in shame. No one had ever heard such cruelty spoken so casually. Before Elias could answer, a calm female voice broke the silence. I'll pay for the milk. Every head in the store turned. The elegant widow from the back of the shop slowly stepped forward. She placed a small leather coin purse onto the wooden counter. The sound of the coins striking the wood echoed through the silent room. She looked directly at Harold. Not one bottle. She slid the purse closer. Give me every bottle of fresh milk you have. The entire store froze. I'll pay for the milk. The calm voice seemed to stop time itself. Every customer turned. Even Harold Whitmore looked surprised. The woman who stepped forward wasn't someone people ignored. She was Margaret Ashford, the wealthiest widow in Ash Creek. When her husband passed away 5 years earlier, he had left behind the largest ranch in the county, acres of fertile land, and enough wealth that Margaret would never have to work another day in her life. Yet, despite her fortune, she rarely spoke, rarely smiled, and almost never involved herself in other people's affairs, which was why no one inside the store expected her to interfere now. Margaret walked calmly toward the counter. Her navy blue dress brushed softly against the wooden floor. In one hand, she carried a small leather coin purse. She placed it gently before Harold. The sound of the coins landing echoed through the silent store. Not one bottle. She looked directly into Harold's eyes. I'll take every bottle of fresh milk you have. The room erupted into whispers. Every bottle. Why? Harold frowned. You don't need that much milk. Margaret answered, without taking her eyes off Elias. No, but someone does. Harold folded his arms. You know this man? No. You know where he came from? No. You know if he's telling the truth? Margaret finally looked at him. I know a hungry baby when I hear one. Harold scoffed. That's all it takes. She calmly replied. It should. Harold shook his head. You've always had a soft heart, Margaret. And that's exactly why men like him exist. He pointed toward Ilias. They know all they need is a sad story. Margaret didn't even glance at Ilias. Instead, she asked Harold a question. When your daughter was born, Harold blinked. What? You remember the first time she cried from hunger? His expression stiffened. Of course. And if someone had refused her milk because they doubted your story? She let the question hang. Harold looked away. He didn't answer. Margaret slowly pushed the purse another inch across the counter. The milk. Harold stared at the coins. Business was business. Refusing payment would only make him look worse. With obvious annoyance, he turned toward the shelves behind him. One by one, he removed bottle after bottle of fresh milk. Glass clinked softly against the wooden counter. The customers watched in complete silence. No one had ever seen Harold lose an argument. Until today, Margaret picked up one bottle. She removed the cork herself, then turned toward Ilias. May I? Ilias looked down at the baby, then back at her. He nodded. Please. Margaret smiled gently. Come. She guided him toward a wooden bench near the front window, where sunlight poured through the glass. Sit. Ilias carefully lowered himself onto the bench. His arms trembled from exhaustion, not because the baby was heavy, because he had almost no strength left. Margaret noticed. She pretended not to. Some acts of kindness preserve dignity by pretending not to notice suffering. She tested the milk against her wrist, just as mothers often did. It isn't warm, she whispered, but it's fresh. Ilias carefully lifted the baby. The little boy's eyelids fluttered weakly. His cries had almost disappeared. Margaret gently held the bottle. The tiny lips searched instinctively. Then, found it. The baby began drinking. Hungrily, desperately, as though he had been waiting his whole life for that first drop. The entire store watched. No one spoke. The only sound inside the building was the quiet rhythm of a hungry child drinking milk. Ilias lowered his head. His shoulders began shaking. At first, Margaret thought he was simply tired. Then she noticed the tears. They fell silently onto the baby's blanket, one after another. He quickly wiped them away. I'm sorry, Margaret softly asked. For what? He smiled through the tears. I thought I was too late. The baby continued drinking. His tiny fingers slowly wrapped around Ilias' thumb. The grip was weak, but it was there. Ilias laughed quietly through his tears. There you are. I was waiting for that. He gently kissed the baby's forehead. You scared me. Several customers looked away, unable to hide their own emotions. The elderly woman, who had remained silent since Ilias entered, quietly removed a handkerchief from her sleeve. The blacksmith swallowed hard. Even the young couple who had laughed earlier now stood frozen with guilt. Margaret couldn't stop watching. She had seen fathers care for their children before. She had seen mothers hold newborns. But there was something different about Ilias. Every movement came naturally. The way he supported the baby's neck, the way he gently rubbed his back between each swallow. the way he instinctively paused every few moments just to make sure the child wasn't drinking too fast. These weren't things a man pretending would know. These were habits learned through sleepless nights, through fear, through love. After several long minutes, the baby's drinking slowed, then stopped. A tiny sigh escaped his lips. For the first time since entering the store, he looked comfortable, safe. His little eyes slowly opened. They immediately searched the room until they found Elias. The moment they did, a tiny smile appeared. Elias smiled back. There he is, my brave little man. The baby reached toward his beard with tiny fingers, grabbing a few strands. The customers laughed softly, not cruelly this time, warmly. It was the first genuine laughter inside the store all morning. Margaret finally asked the question everyone had been wondering. What is his name? Elias looked down at the child. His smile slowly faded. He hesitated. I haven't given him one. Margaret looked surprised. You haven't? Elias slowly shook his head. I kept hoping someone would come looking for him. He glanced toward the store window. I thought maybe his mother or his father would realize what they'd done. His voice became quieter, but no one ever came. Silence settled over the room once again. Margaret looked gently at him. How long? 3 days. You've cared for him for 3 days. Yes. And you've been sleeping where? Elias gave a small smile. Wherever it doesn't rain. A few customers closed their eyes. The image alone was heartbreaking. A homeless man sleeping under abandoned buildings, holding a baby through freezing nights. Harold suddenly broke the silence with a sarcastic laugh. Oh, please. He folded his arms. This is unbelievable. He pointed at Elias. So let me get this straight. You expect everyone here to believe that you just happened to find a baby and suddenly became some kind of saint. Elias calmly answered, I never said I was a saint. Then why keep him? Elias looked down at the sleeping child. His voice was almost a whisper. Because I know what it feels like to be abandoned by the people who were supposed to love you. The words struck Margaret like lightning. She looked at Elias, really looked at him, not at his torn clothes, not at his tired face, at the pain hidden behind his eyes. She realized this story wasn't really about the baby. It was about the man holding him, and whatever had happened to him, it had broken his heart long before it broke his life. She gently sat beside him on the wooden bench. The baby slept peacefully against Elias' chest, his tiny fingers still wrapped around one of Elias. Margaret smiled softly. He trusts you. Elias looked down at the child. I don't know why. You stayed. He nodded. So did you. For the first time in years, Margaret smiled, not politely, not out of courtesy, but because she understood exactly what he meant. She slowly stood. Come with me. Elias looked confused. Where? My home. He immediately shook his head. I couldn't. Why not? I'd only be a burden. Margaret smiled sadly. A burden is someone who takes without caring. She looked at the sleeping baby. You've been giving everything you have. She extended her hand. Please. Elias looked around the store. Every eye was still on him. People who had laughed earlier now couldn't even meet his gaze. He quietly nodded. Just until he gets stronger. Margaret smiled. That's all I'm asking. As they walked toward the door, Harold's voice echoed behind them. You actually believe him? Margaret stopped. Without turning around, she asked, What exactly don't you believe? Harold scoffed. The whole story. You expect me to think a homeless man sacrifices his own food for somebody else's baby? Margaret slowly turned. I don't expect you to. She looked directly into his eyes. I've already seen enough. Then she quietly walked away, leaving Harold standing speechless behind his own counter. Outside, the autumn air felt colder than before. Margaret's carriage waited near the entrance. The coachman quickly climbed down. Ma'am, we're going home. His eyes drifted toward Elias, then toward the baby. Without asking another question, he opened the carriage door. Elias hesitated before climbing inside. He had never ridden in such a beautiful carriage. The leather seats, the polished wooden walls, the soft blankets folded neatly beside each window. Everything reminded him of another life, a life he no longer believed belonged to him. Margaret noticed, You've ridden in one before. It wasn't a question. Elias remained silent. The horses began moving. The wheels rolled gently over the dirt road. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Only the soft breathing of the sleeping baby filled the carriage. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. What happened to you? Elias stared out the window. Golden fields passed by. Children played outside small farmhouses. Families laughed together. He watched them quietly, then asked, Have you ever loved someone so much that you'd rather let them hate you than watch their heart break? Margaret frowned. I don't understand. You will. He closed his eyes. His voice became distant, as though he wasn't speaking to Margaret anymore, as though he were speaking to memories. My mother died when I was 14. She was everything. My father was never the same after losing her. For years, it was just the two of us. His lips formed the faintest smile. He taught me everything. How to ride, how to work the land, how to keep my word. He used to tell everyone, one day this boy will inherit everything I've built. His smile disappeared. Then he met someone else. Margaret listened without interrupting. My father remarried 2 years later. Her name was Victoria. She was beautiful, kind, at least that's what everyone believed. She had a son, Daniel. He was younger than me. Elias looked down at the baby sleeping peacefully. I treated him like a little brother. I taught him to fish. I helped him learn to ride. I even took the blame whenever he broke something around the house. Margaret quietly asked, And him? Elias smiled sadly. He called me his hero. The carriage rolled across a small bridge. Water rushed beneath them. Elias watched it silently. For a while, I believed we were becoming a family. I couldn't have been more wrong. He slowly removed one glove. Across the back of his hand rested an old scar. I didn't notice the lies at first. My father became colder. He stopped asking me to ride with him. He stopped eating dinner with me. He stopped looking at me. the way a father looks at his son. Margaret whispered, "What happened?" Elias looked out the window again. Small things. Money would disappear. I'd be blamed. Workers would quit. Father was told I'd threatened them. Letters arrived, claiming I'd been gambling, drinking, selling pieces of our land behind his back. Were you? No. Did he believe you? Elias closed his eyes. No. He could still remember that night. Rain pounded against the mansion windows. His father stood beside the fireplace. Victoria cried beside him. Daniel hid behind his mother's dress. The old man pointed toward the front door. "I gave you everything." Elias had stood there in complete disbelief. "I didn't do any of this." His father wouldn't even look at him. Victoria quietly sobbed into a handkerchief. "I begged him not to throw you out." Her voice had sounded convincing. Too convincing. His father walked to the large oak desk. He picked up a folded document, then threw it onto the floor at Elias' feet. "You wanted my fortune. You can leave without a single coin." Elias looked at the paper. It was a new will. Everything, the ranch, the land, the business, the savings, every single thing now belonged to Victoria. And Daniel. Margaret covered her mouth. "No." Elias nodded. "My father looked me in the eyes and said something I'll never forget." His voice almost broke. "From this day forward, I no longer have a son." Silence filled the carriage. Even the horses outside seemed quieter. Margaret felt tears forming. "What did you do?" Elias smiled sadly. "I packed one small bag. I walked to the front door. My father never stopped me." He looked down at the sleeping baby. "I kept waiting. One more second. One more heartbeat. I thought, he'll call my name." He didn't. A single tear rolled down Elias' face. I stood outside our home until every light inside went out. I realized the only family I'd ever known had gone to sleep without wondering where I would. He gently kissed the baby's forehead. That's when I learned being abandoned doesn't always happen in an alley. Sometimes it happens inside the home you were born in. Margaret reached across the carriage and quietly placed her hand over his. She didn't offer advice. She didn't offer empty words. Because some pain cannot be comforted, it can only be shared. As the carriage disappeared down the winding country road, neither of them noticed. A man on horseback, watching from the hill above. The rider lowered his telescope. His expression hardened. Then he turned his horse around and galloped toward the largest estate in the county. The carriage rolled through the iron gates of Ashford Manor. Towering oak trees lined the long gravel driveway. Beyond them stood a magnificent stone mansion, overlooking endless fields of golden wheat. To most people, it was a symbol of wealth. To Margaret, it had become a house filled with memories that echoed louder than voices. Ever since her husband died, the rooms had felt too large, too quiet, too empty. The carriage stopped beneath the front entrance. Before the coachman could open the door, the mansion's front doors flew open. 3 housemaids hurried down the steps. Behind them came an elderly woman wearing a white apron. Her gray hair was tied neatly behind her head. She had worked for the Ashford family for almost 40 years. Everyone simply called her Mrs. Aliner. She smiled warmly. "Welcome home, madam." Then her eyes landed on Elias, and finally on the baby sleeping peacefully in his arms. Her smile disappeared, not because she disapproved, because she immediately noticed how thin the child was. "Oh my," she whispered, "that poor little angel." Margaret gently nodded. "Please prepare the nursery." Mrs. Aliner blinked. "The nursery?" Margaret smiled sadly. "It's finally going to be used." The old housekeeper's eyes filled with tears. For years, the nursery had remained untouched, exactly as it had been after Margaret lost her own baby. No one had entered it except to clean away the dust. Today, its silence was finally ending. Inside the mansion, warmth surrounded them. A fire crackled inside the grand fireplace. Fresh bread cooled on the kitchen table. The smell alone made Elias' empty stomach twist painfully. He instinctively looked away. Margaret noticed. "When did you last eat?" Elias smiled awkwardly. "I'm all right." She looked directly at him. "When?" He hesitated. The truth." He lowered his eyes. "Yesterday morning." Margaret froze. "Yesterday?" He nodded. "There wasn't enough money." "For what?" He looked toward the baby. "The milk." Margaret felt her heart break. "You gave him everything." Elias answered quietly. "He needed it more." Mrs. Aliner stepped closer. Her voice trembled. "Sir, please, sit down." She hurried into the kitchen before Elias could object. Minutes later, she returned carrying hot vegetable soup, fresh bread, roasted chicken, warm tea. The table looked like a feast. Elias stared at it, almost afraid to touch it. Margaret smiled. "It's for you." He looked at the food, then at the baby. "Could someone?" He hesitated. "Hold him." Mrs. Aliner immediately stretched out her arms. "I'd be honored." She carefully lifted the sleeping child, cradling him as though he had always belonged there. Only then, only after making absolutely certain the baby was comfortable, did Elias finally sit. He picked up the spoon. His hands trembled, not because the soup was hot, because he couldn't remember the last time someone had prepared a meal just for him. He slowly took the first bite. Warmth spread through his body. His eyes closed. For several seconds, he simply sat there, silent. Then tears rolled down his face. He quickly wiped them away. "I'm sorry," Margaret softly asked. "Why do you keep apologizing?" Elias smiled sadly. "Because I forgot what it feels like to be treated like a human being." The room fell completely silent. One of the younger maids quietly turned away, so no one would see her crying. Meanwhile, several miles away, a horse galloped through the gates of Reed Manor. The rider leaped from his saddle. "I need to see Mr. Jonathan Reed." Servants hurried him inside. Moments later, an elderly man with silver hair entered the library. Though age had bent his shoulders, his eyes still carried authority. This was Jonathan Reed, once one of the wealthiest landowners in the county. Now, a lonely old man whose estate felt emptier with every passing year. "What is it?" The rider removed his hat. "I found him." Jonathan frowned. "Found who?" The writer swallowed. "Your son." The room became still. Jonathan's breathing stopped. "What?" His voice barely came out. "Did you say?" "I saw him entering Ashford Manor." Jonathan slowly lowered himself into a chair. His hands began shaking. For years, he had secretly sent men to neighboring towns, not to bring Elias home. He had been too proud for that. Only to know whether he was still alive. Every report had ended the same way. No sign. Until today. "How?" Jonathan whispered. "How did he look?" The writer hesitated. His answer seemed almost cruel. "He looked homeless." Jonathan closed his eyes. The single word struck harder than any weapon. Homeless. His son, the boy who had once ridden the finest horses, slept in the finest rooms, owned more books than most schools, was now homeless. The writer continued quietly. He wasn't alone. Jonathan opened his eyes. "What do you mean?" "He was carrying a baby." Jonathan frowned. "A baby?" "Yes. I don't know if it was his. But," the writer hesitated again, "he protected that child like it was the most precious thing in the world." Jonathan looked toward the fireplace. His vision blurred. Suddenly, he remembered another little boy, barely 7 years old, running through the fields, carrying an injured baby bird. "Dad," young Elias had shouted. "We have to save him." Jonathan had laughed. "It's only a bird." Young Elias had looked horrified. "But he doesn't know that." Jonathan remembered helping his son build a tiny nest from straw. For weeks, the boy fed the bird every morning before school. Only after it recovered did he let it fly away. Jonathan smiled through tears. "He always had your mother's heart," he whispered to himself. His smile vanished. Then came the memory he had spent years trying to bury. Rained. The front door. Elias standing there with one small bag. Looking back. Waiting. Jonathan remembered seeing him pause. Just once, as though hoping his father would stop him. Jonathan almost had. Almost. His lips had even begun to move. Then, Victoria placed a hand on his arm. "Don't let him manipulate you." And Jonathan stayed silent. Back at Ashford Manor, Elias had just finished his meal. Every bowl on the table sat empty. He looked embarrassed. "I didn't mean." Mrs. Aliner smiled warmly. "I've never been happier to wash dishes." Everyone laughed softly. Even Elias. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was the first genuine laugh he had shared in years. Margaret noticed it immediately. She quietly thought, "There's still light inside him. Someone just spent years trying to bury it." She looked toward the sleeping baby in Mrs. Aliner's arms. Then back at Elias. She made a silent promise. Whatever had been stolen from this man, she was going to uncover the truth, even if it meant confronting the most powerful family in the county. Because deep inside, she no longer believed this was just a story about a homeless man. She believed someone had stolen his life. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of Ashford Manor. For the first time in days, Elias didn't wake to freezing wind. He didn't wake to hungry cries echoing beneath an abandoned loading dock. He woke to warmth, the crackling of a fireplace, the smell of fresh bread, and the gentle sound of a baby laughing. Elias slowly opened his eyes. For a moment, he didn't recognize the room. Soft blankets, clean wooden floors, sunlight dancing across cream-colored curtains. Then he heard it again, a tiny giggle. He turned. Mrs. Aliner sat beside the fireplace with the baby on her lap. The little boy happily reached toward the dancing flames, fascinated by the flickering light. Mrs. Aliner laughed softly. "Oh no, young man, we don't touch fire," the baby answered with another laugh. Elias couldn't stop smiling. He hadn't heard laughter like that since finding the child. Back on the streets, every cry had been filled with hunger, with fear. Now, for the first time, the little boy sounded exactly how babies were meant to sound. Happy, safe. Mrs. Aliner noticed Elias awake. "Good morning." He quietly sat up. "How long did I sleep?" She smiled. "Nearly 14 hours. Elias blinked. 14. You were exhausted." She hesitated. "The doctor says your body was beginning to shut down." Elias looked surprised. There was a doctor. Margaret entered the room, carrying a breakfast tray. "There is now." She smiled warmly. "He examined both of you during the night. And the baby is healthy." Her smile faded slightly. "But you," she looked directly at Elias, "were 1 or 2 days away from collapsing." Elias lowered his eyes. "I would have been all right." Margaret gently shook her head. "No, you would have kept feeding him and forgotten yourself." He didn't answer, because she was right. Meanwhile, across town, Jonathan Reed hadn't slept. His untouched dinner still sat beside the fireplace. The candles had burned themselves into melted pools of wax. All night, he had stared at one object resting on his desk, a faded family portrait. His late wife, a young Elias, and himself, all smiling, before everything fell apart. There was a quiet knock at the library door. "Come in." Victoria entered gracefully. Despite the passing years, she still carried herself with elegance. Behind her walked Daniel, now a grown man, well-dressed, confident, everything Jonathan had once believed his eldest son wasn't. Victoria smiled. "You were awake all night again." Jonathan didn't answer. Daniel noticed the portrait, thinking about him again. Jonathan finally looked up. "I found your brother." The room froze. Victoria's smile disappeared for the briefest moment. Only a second. Then it returned. "You did. He's alive." Daniel forced a smile. "That's wonderful." But something in his voice sounded wrong. Jonathan slowly stood. "I've spent years blaming myself." Victoria gently placed a hand on his arm. "You made the only decision you could with the information you had." Jonathan looked at her. "Did I?" She nodded. "Elias betrayed you. He stole from you. He lied to you. He tried to destroy this family." Jonathan stared silently at the portrait, then quietly asked, "Did he?" Victoria's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Jonathan walked toward the window. "I've repeated those words for 12 years. He closed his eyes. "But last night, I kept asking myself one question." He turned around. Where was the proof? Silence. Victoria forced a small laugh. There was plenty of proof. Jonathan slowly walked toward her. Show me. She blinked. What? The letters, the financial records, the witnesses. Bring them. She hesitated. They've been gone for years. Jonathan nodded slowly. Convenient. Daniel shifted nervously. Father. Jonathan raised his hand. No. His voice remained calm. Too calm. I've done enough talking. He looked toward the family lawyer, standing quietly near the doorway. Mr. Collins, the elderly lawyer, stepped forward. Yes, sir. I want every financial record from 12 years ago. Every letter, every bank statement, every employee ledger. No exceptions. Victoria immediately interrupted. Jonathan, this is ridiculous. He looked directly at her. No, my throwing away my own son, without asking enough questions. That was ridiculous. Victoria's composure finally cracked. You still don't trust him. Jonathan answered quietly. I don't trust myself anymore. Daniel's breathing became uneven. His eyes darted toward his mother. She gave him the slightest shake of her head. Don't say anything. Jonathan noticed. His heart sank. For years, he had ignored tiny moments like that. Today, he finally saw them. Hours later, Mr. Collins returned carrying 3 dusty wooden boxes. They were stored in the old records room. Jonathan opened the first box. Inside were ledgers, receipts, property records. Nothing unusual. He opened the second. Letters, dozens of them. Some accusing Elias of gambling. Others accusing him of selling livestock. Jonathan frowned. Something caught his attention. The signatures. He picked up 3 different letters. Then 4. Then 5. His hands began trembling. Every signature looked exactly the same. Too perfect. Too identical. As though one person had written all of them. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses. Sir, Jonathan looked at him. The lawyer swallowed. I've worked with handwriting for over 40 years. He held the papers closer to the light. I don't believe these were written by different people. Victoria's face turned pale. Jonathan slowly turned toward her. What did you do? She remained silent. What? His voice cracked. Did you do? Daniel suddenly stepped backward. His breathing became frantic. His mother reached for him, but he pulled away. His voice shook uncontrollably. I can't, Victoria whispered. Daniel, no. He covered his face. I can't do this anymore. Jonathan stared at him. What are you talking about? Daniel collapsed into a chair. Tears streamed down his face. I was 14. I didn't understand. Mom said, if Elias inherited everything, we'd have nothing. Victoria grabbed his arm. Stop. He pulled away. You told me, if I loved you, I'd keep quiet. Jonathan's knees weakened. No. Daniel sobbed harder. The letters, she wrote them. The servants, she paid them. The missing money, she hid it herself. Every word struck Jonathan like a hammer. And Daniel buried his face in his hands. I lied every single time. The library fell deathly silent. Jonathan slowly looked toward Victoria. She no longer cried. She no longer pretended. Her expression had become cold, almost emotionless. You were always going to leave everything to him. Jonathan whispered, "He was my son. So was Daniel. You already had everything." She laughed bitterly. "Not everything. I wanted certainty. You would have changed your will one day. So I made sure you changed it sooner." Jonathan staggered backward, his eyes filled with tears. For 12 years, he had believed his son had betrayed him. For 12 years, he had cursed the name of the boy who had done nothing wrong. For 12 years, his real son had slept on cold streets while he lived inside a mansion built on lies. A broken sob escaped his lips. "My boy," he whispered. "My boy." He sank to his knees. "I threw my own son away, and he never even tried to defend himself." Mr. Collins quietly wiped his eyes. "He did try, sir." Jonathan looked up. The lawyer's voice trembled. "I remember. He stood right there and kept saying, 'Father, please believe me.' I wanted to speak, but you ordered everyone to leave." Jonathan closed his eyes. The memory came rushing back. He heard Elias' voice again. He saw his frightened face. He remembered the long pause at the front door, the way Elias had turned around one last time, waiting, hoping for his father to call him back. Jonathan finally understood. His son hadn't paused because he wanted the fortune. He had paused because he still wanted his father. Jonathan covered his face and wept like a man whose heart had finally broken. And miles away, completely unaware that the truth had finally come to light, Elias sat beneath an old oak tree in Margaret's garden, smiling as the little boy took his very first wobbly crawl across the grass. The morning sun bathed Ashford Manor in a warm golden glow. In the garden, the little boy sat on a blanket beneath the shade of an old oak tree. He had discovered something fascinating: a butterfly every time it landed on a flower. He laughed every time it flew away. He reached after it with both tiny hands. Elias sat beside him, smiling. "You'll catch one someday." The little boy looked back at him, as if he understood, then laughed again. It was a beautiful sound, one Elias had prayed to hear ever since finding him in that lonely alley. From the front porch, Margaret watched quietly. Mrs. Alina joined her with 2 cups of tea. "I've never seen you smile this much." Margaret's eyes remained fixed on the garden. "I haven't had a reason in years." Mrs. Alina nodded. "He belongs here." Margaret smiled softly. "They both do." The peaceful morning was interrupted by the distant sound of horses, several of them moving fast. The estate's gatekeeper hurried toward the entrance. A cloud of dust rose beyond the front gate. Moments later, a carriage followed by 4 riders came to an abrupt stop outside Ashford Manor. Margaret immediately recognized the family crest painted on its door. The Reed family. The carriage door opened before the coachman could assist. Jonathan Reed stepped out. He looked nothing like the proud landowner the town had known for decades. His clothes were neat, but his face had aged years overnight. His eyes were swollen. His hands trembled. He looked less like a wealthy man and more like a father who had finally realized the cost of his own mistakes. Margaret walked down the steps. "Mr. Reed." Jonathan removed his hat. His voice barely came out. "I've come to see my son." Margaret studied him carefully. "The son you disowned." Jonathan lowered his head. "Yes." She didn't move. "Why now?" He swallowed. "Because yesterday I learned the truth." Margaret looked into his eyes. For the first time, she didn't see pride. She saw regret, real regret. Without saying another word, she stepped aside. "He's in the garden." Jonathan nodded gratefully. Every step he took felt heavier than the last. His legs seemed unwilling to carry him forward. Fear had finally replaced pride. What if Elias refused to see him? What if he had every right to? Across the lawn, Elias hadn't noticed anyone. He was helping the little boy stack smooth river stones. Each time the tiny tower fell over, the child burst into laughter. Elias laughed with him. Again, the little boy clapped excitedly. "Again it is." Jonathan stopped several yards away. He couldn't speak. For 12 years, he had imagined this moment. He had rehearsed countless speeches, countless apologies. Now, standing behind his son, every word disappeared. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "Elias." The name floated gently across the garden. Elias froze. Slowly, he turned around. The smile on his face disappeared. For a long moment, neither man moved. The years between them suddenly felt longer than a lifetime. The little boy looked curiously between the two strangers, completely unaware that he was witnessing two broken hearts standing face to face. Jonathan's lips trembled. He struggled to continue. "You've grown older." Elias gave a faint smile. "So have you." Silence returned. Only birds could be heard singing in the nearby trees. Jonathan slowly took another step. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know I don't deserve forgiveness." His eyes filled with tears. "But before I die, I need you to know I was wrong." The words shattered whatever pride he still carried. He dropped to his knees. There, in the middle of Margaret's garden, the richest man in the county knelt before the son he had cast into the streets. Mrs. Aliner covered her mouth. Several servants quietly stopped working. Even Margaret felt tears gathering in her eyes. Jonathan bowed his head. "I failed you. I failed your mother. I believed lies because they were easier to believe than asking my own son the truth." His shoulders shook. For 12 years, I told myself I had done the right thing. But every birthday, every Christmas, every empty chair at the dinner table, I wondered if you were cold, if you were hungry, if you were alive. His voice broke completely. And while I slept beneath a warm roof, my son was sleeping on the streets. Elias stood perfectly still. His face revealed nothing. Not anger, not joy, only quiet reflection. Jonathan continued, "I came to bring you home. The estate is yours. The land, the house, everything. I've already changed the will. I've disowned Victoria. Daniel confessed everything. The truth is known." He lifted his tear-filled eyes. "Please, come home." Elias looked down at the little boy, playing beside his feet. The child picked up one of the smooth stones, then proudly handed it to him, as though it were the greatest treasure in the world. Elias smiled. "Thank you." He slipped the little stone into his pocket, then looked back at his father. Quietly, he walked forward. Jonathan's breathing stopped. For one impossible moment, he thought his son might embrace him. Instead, Elias knelt, not to hug him, but so they were eye to eye. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "You know what hurt the most?" Jonathan closed his eyes. No, it wasn't losing the house. It wasn't losing the money. It wasn't sleeping outside. A tear rolled down Elias' cheek. It was waiting at the front door, believing that any second my father would call me back. Jonathan let out a broken sob. Elias continued. "I waited until the lights in the house went out. I kept thinking, he's still angry. Tomorrow he'll come looking for me." He smiled sadly. Tomorrow never came. Jonathan couldn't stop crying. "I'm sorry. I know. I'm so sorry. I know. I don't deserve another chance." "No, you don't." The words struck like a knife. Jonathan lowered his head, accepting them because they were true. After a long silence, Elias reached out, not to punish, not to accuse. He gently placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "But," Jonathan slowly looked up, "my mother used to tell me something. Bitterness is a prison with invisible walls. If I spend the rest of my life hating you, then Victoria wins." He smiled through his tears. "And I've already let her steal enough years from both of us." Jonathan stared at him, unable to believe what he was hearing. Elias helped his father to his feet. "I forgive you." The words were quiet, but they carried more weight than any shouted sentence ever could. Jonathan collapsed into his son's embrace. For the first time in 12 long years, a father held his son again. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Some wounds begin healing the moment forgiveness is chosen. Behind them, the little boy clapped his tiny hands and laughed, as though even he understood that something beautiful had just been restored. The embrace lasted only a few seconds, but for Jonathan Reed, it healed 12 years of silence. When they finally stepped apart, neither man tried to hide the tears on his face. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to pretend, only a father and the son he had almost lost forever. Jonathan looked toward the little boy playing in the grass. The child had discovered a dandelion. He blew on it with all the strength his tiny lungs could manage. The seeds barely moved. He frowned, then laughed at himself. Jonathan smiled through his tears. "He's beautiful." Elias looked at the child. "He is? What's his name?" Elias became quiet. "I never gave him one." Jonathan looked surprised. "No, I kept telling myself his parents would come back." He smiled sadly. "I didn't want to erase the family he might still have." Jonathan nodded slowly. "But they never came." "No." Margaret walked across the garden, carrying a small blanket. She spread it across the grass beside them, then sat down. "So," she smiled warmly, "perhaps today is the day." Elias looked at her. The day he finally gets a name." The little little boy crawled over and climbed into Elias' lap, as though he had already chosen where he belonged. Jonathan watched quietly. "You saved his life." Elias gently brushed the child's hair away from his eyes. "No, he saved mine." Everyone looked at him. Elias smiled. "The day I found him, I was ready to stop trying. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't slept. I'd spent years believing that no one would ever need me again." He looked down at the child. Then I heard him crying. I picked him up, thinking I was rescuing him. He laughed softly, but every morning, he gave me a reason to stand up. He reminded me that even someone with nothing can still give everything. Margaret quietly wiped away a tear. "You know, I think he found exactly who he needed." Mrs. Aliner nodded from the porch. "So do I." Several weeks later, the county courthouse overflowed with people. News of the Reed family reconciliation had spread across Ash Creek. But that wasn't why the courtroom was full. Today, a judge was making a decision that would change one little life forever. The little boy sat happily in Elias' arms, completely unaware of the importance of the moment. The judge smiled warmly after reviewing every report and hearing testimony from the sheriff, the church, Mrs. Ashford, and dozens of townspeople. He looked directly at Elias. "It is the opinion of this court that no one could have loved this child more faithfully than you already have." He signed the final document. "The child is now legally yours." A single tear rolled down Elias' face. He kissed the little boy's forehead. "Welcome home." Outside the courthouse, Jonathan approached quietly. "I have something." He handed Elias a small wooden box. Inside lay a tiny silver compass. Elias immediately recognized it. "My grandfather's." Jonathan nodded. "He gave it to me the day I became a father." He smiled sadly. "I wasn't worthy of passing it on then." He gently closed Elias' hand around it. "I hope I am now." Elias looked at the old compass for several seconds, then quietly whispered, "Thank you." Months passed. Spring slowly transformed Ash Creek. Flowers bloomed where winter had once left everything gray. The old Whitmore General Store had changed ownership after Harold's cruelty became the talk of the county. The faded sign above the entrance was replaced with a new one. Ash Creek General Store. Its very first rule hung beside the counter. Not for decoration, not for business, but as a promise. No hungry child will ever be turned away. Every bottle of milk given to a struggling family was quietly paid for through a fund Margaret had established. No questions, no humiliation, no shame. Jonathan kept another promise too. A large section of the Reed estate was transformed into the Grace House, a refuge for abandoned children, widowed parents, and families who had nowhere else to go. Every room was warm. Every bed was clean. Every table had food. Above the entrance, a simple wooden plaque read, "No one should have to beg to be loved." One warm afternoon, the garden behind Ashford Manor echoed with laughter. The little boy ran across the grass on unsteady legs. Gone was the weak, hungry infant wrapped in a dirty blanket. His cheeks were full. His laughter was loud. His eyes sparkled with joy. He stumbled. Before he could fall, two hands reached for him at the same time. Elias caught him from one side, Jonathan from the other. The little boy burst into giggles. Jonathan laughed. "I think he's faster than both of us." Elias grinned. "I hope he always is." Margaret watched from the porch. Mrs. Alina joined her. "Have you noticed something?" Margaret smiled. "What?" "The house doesn't feel empty anymore." Margaret looked toward the garden. A father laughing, a grandfather laughing, a little boy laughing louder than both. She quietly answered, "No, it finally feels like home." That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Elias carried the little boy back toward the house. The child rested sleepily on his shoulder, tiny arms wrapped around his neck. Just before drifting off, the little boy whispered his very first clear word, "Dada." Elias stopped walking. His eyes filled instantly. He looked down at the child. "You called me." The little boy smiled in his sleep. "Dada." Jonathan quietly turned away to hide his tears. Margaret covered her mouth. Mrs. Alina smiled through tears. Elias gently kissed the child's forehead. "I may not have given you life," he whispered, "but you've given mine back to me." As the front door closed behind them, the home that had once echoed with loneliness was now filled with something far greater than wealth. It was filled with forgiveness, with hope, with second chances, and with a family that hadn't been built by blood, but by love.